Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I have tidbits and I have a finished project with an interesting combination of techniques, including tuck stitch. And I'll share how I'll be starting Tour de Fleece. So let's get started. This tidbit comes from Christopher on Ravelry. It's a link to a blog post about an item that was commonly used in previous centuries called a HUSSIF or housewife. Essentially, it's a portable or traveling sewing kit with little slots or pockets for things like snips, needles and pins, thread, and spare buttons. The blog post is short and it includes a brief video about the HUSSIF. But I was intrigued, so I wanted to do a little bit more research. So it turns out that HUSSIFs weren't used only by women. They were a common thing that was given to soldiers so that they could repair their clothing. I found several articles in British and Australian newspapers regarding the receipt of HUSSIFs, along with socks and other sorts of comforts for soldiers. So these little articles often give credit to the specific person or groups that had donated items, and then they would list off what was specifically donated. This article here from a newspaper published in Bristol, England in October of 1914 lists receipt of various items made or collected by different people, including 3 HUSSIFs. This article from Melbourne, Australia's The Age newspaper, published on the 21st of February in 1940, asks specifically for HUSSIFs and includes instructions for how to make them and what should be included in the HUSSIF. The only mention I could find in an American newspaper dates from 1986, and in that article, instructions were given for creating a plastic canvas covered bolster shaped HUSSIF. I found another longer post from someone who is making an 18th century HUSSIF, and that post included a photograph and a link to a HUSSIF contained in the collections at Colonial Williamsburg. And that particular HUSSIF, the claim is that it was made from gowns that Martha Washington wore in the White House during George Washington's presidency. So it was a really fun little rabbit hole to go down. I will leave links down in the show notes to all the different blog posts and museum items so that you can check them out for yourself. This tidbit came via email from Mary Lou. She shared 2 videos on the processing of fiber. I was telling you last week about how I was processing some raw fleece in order to spin it for Tour de Fleece. So one of the videos that Mary Lou shared was one that I shared, I think, sometime last year. It's from Rob Stevens' YouTube channel, and it's called Flax to Linen, Sewing to Sewing. It's a 20-minute video that shows the whole process of sowing flax seeds, growing the plants, processing the flax for spinning, and then weaving the flax yarn into linen cloth, which can then be sewed. So flax is just a really fascinating fiber to me. When you see the entire process, you may wonder how many centuries of building on skills did it take to figure out this entire process of converting this plant into a yarn that it just is hopelessly stiff, and then weaving it into a fabric that becomes soft and drapey as it's used and worn. It's just amazing that people figured this out. Now, the second video that Mary Lou sent is one of a woman who raises sheep and alpaca. It's a 10-acre farm is, I think, the name of the YouTube channel. In the video, she demonstrates her process of scouring wool using 5-gallon paint buckets in her kitchen, as well as how she continues through the process of drying the wool, picking it to separate the fibers, and carding it. And then her daughter demonstrates spinning the fiber. They show the process of skeins up the yarn and some of the things that they make with their wool. I think what's most interesting to me is how relaxed she was about her process. at each stage. There were multiple points where I thought, what is she doing? I would never do it that way. But it works for her. I'm often saying that there is more than one way to get to the same endpoint, but sometimes the endpoint we want isn't the same endpoint someone else wants. The paths we take might be very similar and have similar landmarks, but they aren't taking us to the same destination. So her process would not produce the end result yarn that I would want, but that doesn't make one of us wrong and the other right. The goal is always to find the path that takes you where you want to end up. So I'll leave links to those videos down in the show notes. This tidbit came to me from Tigger 1983. It's a stocking pattern in the form of a poem. It was published in the Jenny June series of manuals for ladies, knitting and crochet, a guide to the use of the needle and hook, edited by Jenny June. What Tigger 1983 wanted to point out was that there was a stocking pattern within the book that was in the form of a poem. It starts out like this. To knit a stocking, needles 4, cast on 3 needles and no more. Each needle stitches 8 and 20, then 1 for seam stitch will be plenty. For 20 rounds your stitch must be 2 plain, 2 purl alternately, except the seam stitch, which you do once purl, once plain, the whole way through. So what this means is that you have 4 DPNs, double pointed needles, you cast on 28 stitches onto each of 3 needles, because the 4th is your working needle, and you add 1 extra stitch to one of those needles, and that stitch is going to be the seam stitch. So the seam stitch is something that was commonly used in knitted stockings, and it marked the beginning of the round. It ran up the back of the leg, marked the beginning of the round, and it was used as a landmark to place your calf shaping and decreases in the correct place so that they weren't off. You would know that you just need to work them 1 stitch away or 2 stitches away from that column of seam stitches. You then work 20 rounds in knit 2 purl 2 ribbing, except for the seam stitch, which is worked as a column of garter stitch by knitting it in 1 round and then purling it in the next round. That makes it really easy to count your rounds by 2s because you can just look at all of the purl bumps. And it is also in a different stitch pattern than the rest of the stocking is. Now obviously there's more to this stocking than just what I read to you. It goes on for the entire stocking. So I'll leave a link down in the show notes to a digitized version of this book so you can look through it yourself. Now aside from that being an interesting way of presenting a stocking pattern, I had questions about this Jenny June woman. I had heard of Jenny June previously, but I didn't really know anything about her or her series of books, or even whether or not there was a real person behind the Jenny June name. And it turns out there was. Jenny June was the pseudonym of Jane Cunningham Crowley, who was born in England in 1829 and immigrated with her family to the United States when she was 12. She was very interested in journalism, but given that it was the 19th century, she had difficulty getting employment in the field, doing anything other than covering so-called women's interests. She did eventually get work, and through her work met her husband, who was also a journalist. He later hired her to write for his newspaper, and she continued to work after they were married and had children. She also organized and founded the Women's Clubs of New York, as well as the Federation of Women's Clubs. She advocated for women having equal opportunity in employment for her entire life. So I will leave a link down below, not just to the Jenny June book that has the poem in it, but also to a Wikipedia article about her, because I think she was a really fascinating person. So it's no secret, I love to knit socks. Most of the time, what I am focused on is just getting a good fit, customizing the fit. So socks are the one thing that I knit for a lot of different people. And it's also something that I have fit issues with. So I've really learned over the years how to modify different kinds of heels and toes in order to fit different feet that might have different fit issues. I consider myself kind of a construction nerd and a technique geek. And so when I come across something interesting that has to do with sock heels and toes, it draws me in. I want to try them out. That's one of the reasons I'm doing this sort of evolution of hand knit stockings project where I'm knitting stockings from different centuries. I'm focused on how they were constructed and the techniques that were used, how the heels and toes were done differently. That's just really interesting to me. The socks I tend to knit are just regular socks, you know, mid-calf socks. So a sock that, you know, comes up to about here, right before you get to the bulge of your calf. I don't knit shorty socks typically, mostly because I don't wear them. I have, you know, a shoebox full of cotton footies that I bought probably 20 years ago that I will wear if I'm wearing a pair of tennis shoes and doing yard work or something. But if I'm just out walking on the streets or going somewhere, I'm rarely wearing socks in the summertime. I'm either wearing sandals or I'm wearing shoes that don't require socks. Like I have these Allbirds wool sneakers because the fabric is wool and the insole is wool. If my feet sweat, the shoes aren't going to stink, and they're very comfortable without socks. But a couple of weeks ago, I bought a pair of hiking shoes because when we're not walking in our neighborhood, we go to like a nature preserve where they just have nature trails, and sometimes, you know, the trail is a little more rustic, a lot more rustic than a city sidewalk is, and especially on hills, I find that I tend to slip if I'm wearing something like a pair of Allbirds. So I got myself a pair of hiking shoes. And I knew that I wanted to wear wool socks with those, not the cotton footies. I just would prefer, you know, if I'm going to be doing something like that, to wear wool, and I didn't want to wear the long wool socks. So I thought shorties would be a good solution. And I was just thinking about how am I going to keep them from getting pulled down into the shoe, just to make sure they don't get pulled down, because that can happen when you have a shorty sock. And I was thinking about, oh, when I was a kid, we used to have pom-poms. I don't know if I wanted to do that. I don't love making pom-poms. And when I was thinking about all of this, I saw a post in my Instagram feed show up where someone was knitting a pair of shorties. But what drew my attention was there was a really interesting heel. I could tell it was some kind of short row heel, but I couldn't tell how it was done. And I saw that the short row heel had a gusset, which adds additional room because short row heels tend to be too shallow. I always have to modify them in order for them to fit me because I have fit issues with the heels. And so I thought that was really interesting, and I just couldn't figure out how the heel was done. So I looked up the sock pattern on Ravelry, and then I saw there was an additional technique that was even more interesting, and it was a technique that the point of it is to prevent the sock from getting pulled down inside the shoe. So what I want to do is go to the overhead, show you these socks, and then talk about some of the techniques that are used in this sock, because I just thought it was really interesting, and it was well worth. I think the pattern's like €5.50, something like that. Totally worth it with, you know, new things to learn, which is what I love the most. So let's go to the overhead and I will show you that. So this is what the sock looks like. These are called tuck shorties. Now the pattern calls for a contrast yarn to be used for these tuck stitches, and you can kind of see that this black, I know, is super dark, but you can see how they sticks out from the surface of the stockinette. And then she calls for alternating 2 row stripes of the 2 colors for the toe. I originally was going to use the red just all the way down, but I could tell I wasn't going to have enough to do that. And I wasn't even sure I was going to have enough. It would have been cutting it extremely close to work in the 2 row stripes. I didn't know if I would really have enough to do the stripes for both of them. So I had plenty of black, and so I just did the toes in black. I realize this is a very 80s, late 80s, early 90s color combination. What can I say? So there's this kind of little stitch pattern that creates a purl stitch every once in a while on the background of the stockinette. And the heel, the preparation for the heel turn begins pretty close after the tuck stitches end. And it's done by, you work some increases on each side of the sock every couple of rounds until you have the total number that are needed. And as you're working them, you're creating them, you're working those in purl stitches. So all of this over here is the original stitches that were on the needle, and all of these are the original stitches on the needle. These are the extra ones. And then you work the short row heel. So this is what was interesting to me, is seeing what this looked like. When we normally talk about a short row heel, we're usually talking about what's called an hourglass short row heel. Because it starts out with the longest rows, and then you get gradually shorter and shorter and shorter until you have like usually about a third of the stitches remaining. And then you start working longer and longer short rows, and so it gets wider that way. So if you were to look at this laid out flat, it would have the shape of an hourglass. So that's how it's typically worked. The first half gets increasingly shorter, and the next half gets increasingly wider. What this heel does is is different. It starts out like a regular hourglass short row heel, where you're getting increasingly shorter and shorter short rows, but then for the second half of the heel, you do the same thing. You start with the longer short rows, and then you work shorter short rows. You're not incorporating these added stitches into the heel turn. They're just there to provide more room across here. So maybe in 2018, I did a series of videos on improving the fit in short row heels, and it was hourglass short row heels and also peasant heels, because they have basically the same shape. And so one of the ways that you can do that, I showed, was to do increases like this. So this triangle right here of the increases, and then just work the heel as you would over the original number of stitches. But in my case, I was just keeping them in stockinette. So that's what I think is really interesting, is to see this little triangle done as a decorative element that keeps things separate. What I usually do when I am working the short row heel is I do the increases, and then all of the extra stitches I actually will include in my short row heel turn, so that I have more rows of short row. It creates a deeper heel, as well as giving me the extra room I need across here. So it's just two different approaches, and so the videos I have kind of tell you how to how to know if you need to modify it, and then how you know how much to modify it, and then the different approaches that you can do. So it's really hard to see what's going on with the tuck stitch in the sock, other than you can see it goes all the way around. And you can also see that there's some three-dimensionality, that these tuck stitches are creating some extra circumference to the sock. What's going to be easier is to see the tuck stitches in this hat. Bigger stitches, a solid color, and a light color, so you can see what's going on. So the tuck stitches are shortening the fabric vertically, because what you're doing is you're working stitches that are on the needle together with a stitch that's a number of rows below the needle. And in this case, it's only done across a span of stitches. It's not done in the entire round. So let me show you how this kind of situation works, and then I'll give you an idea of how it's worked in this sock. So I've got a number of rows of the blue right here. I've just worked across some of them. I'm only going to work tuck stitches across a few of these stitches. So what I want to do is I want to work this stitch on the needle together with a stitch that's, say, 4 rows below. So we've got this V right here is the stitch below the needle. That's 1 row below, 2, 3, and 4. So we want to work it together with this stitch. And we're going to work it together with the head of the stitch that's on the back of the work. So the purl bump that we see in the back. So if we look at this stitch right here, we can see that this purl bump that's right under the needle, that is the head of this stitch that's under the needle. It's what joins the 2 legs of those stitches together. So if we count down 1, 2, 3, 4, this is the head of the stitch that is 4 rows below the needle. So there are more purl bumps than just these. You'll see how the heads of the stitches have these purl bumps right here, and then you've got these offset ones here. Those are the running threads between stitches on a row above this one. So we are wanting to work this stitch together with the 4th purl bump down. So there's a few ways that you can do that. One is you can take your left needle, so you can count down 4 bumps from the stitch on the needle and get your left needle through that, and then you can work those 2 stitches together. I find that to be the most challenging way of doing it. Another way is to use your right hand needle and count down 1, 2, 3, 4. Stick it down from above like this, and then lift it on the needle there, and then you can work those 2 stitches together. And there's a third way that you can do it, which is to capture all of the heads of the stitches that you need. So let's say we just want to, the only other stitches we want to do the tuck stitch on are these next 4 stitches on the needle. So I want to count down 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I want to get this one. I'm going to use a thinner needle than what I'm using for the yarn. So I'm going to come from above, grab that one, grab the next one next to it, 2, 3, 4, and I can, confirm that that's 4 below. Now I can work it like a 3 needle bind off or a 3 needle join. So it's like a 3 needle bind off without the binding off part. You're just working the first stitch on each needle together, like a knit 2 together. So I insert through the front needle, through the back needle, wrap the yarn around, pull it through, let that one off the needle, pull it through the one on the front, let that one off the needle. That's my preference for how to do it. You can put it through both stitches and then pull it through both of them and then let both of those off the needle. But I find I make more mistakes and things fall off the needle more easily if I do it that way. So I pull it through the first one, let that one off the needle, pull it through the front one, let that one off the needle. So any of these ways, whichever way works for you is the best way to do it. And so then you can see how this fabric has been shortened right here because it's become more 3-dimensional like that. So I'm going to work a few more rows, and I'm going to switch to some white, and then I'm going to show you how you can do this with a contrast yarn, how you might want to do this. All right, so I joined the white yarn at the beginning of a right side row, and I worked 4 rows. So what that results in is actually 3 rows of white below the needles and 1 row on the needles. So now what I want to do is create tuck stitches with the white. So if we were to do what we did with the blue, where we were joining the head of a stitch together with the stitch on the needle, and I wanted to do that with just the white stitches, I would be looking 3 rows below the needle because I've got three rows below what I've got on now. So I would be lifting this stitch up. This is the first white head of a stitch up onto the needle so that I could work those together using the blue yarn. So when I do that, I get this right here. So this is a little flatter than this one because this was joining 4 rows together, and here I'm joining 3 rows together. But if you look, I have this going on right here, and that is a little flatter and more pronounced. And the way that this effect is done, instead of bringing the first head of a stitch up to the needle, I'm going to bring a running thread up. So you'll see that that first row of white stitches, you get these blips on the back. So you have a blue stitch head here, but then you have the white running threads here. So the white running threads are a little bit lower in the fabric than the head of the stitch. So I could lift up the running thread instead. So I need to pick, am I going to do the one that is to toward the tip that from the head or further from the tip? I could do either one. So in this case, we're going to do the one that is closer to the tip. So let's do 4 of these. And again, I can use that trick of loading things up on the needle by and they're very easy to see when they're contrast. Very easy to know that you're not getting, you know, offset by a row because they are a contrast. So now we can work these together. So it gives a slightly different result, but as long as you're doing the same thing for all of the stitches, nobody is going to be able to tell by looking at it. But just know, especially if you're using a smaller number of rows, like I only joined 3 rows together, and I created some dimensionality, a little bit wider, and then this is a little flatter and more pronounced. And that's just because the loop was further down in the fabric. Tour de Fleece starts tomorrow, July 1st. It is a 23-day challenge. There's 2 rest days in there that coincides with Tour de France. So when the cyclists are cycling, spinners are spinning. And the idea is it's not a contest. It's an opportunity for you to, along with other spinners, set personal challenges for yourself, make it fun, and just spin. So I have been, for the past couple of weeks, doing things like processing the raw fleece I bought at Shepherd's Harvest. I bought some samplers of different rare breeds. I washed those. I also have some other wools that were already washed of rare breeds that I want to spin and then knit up and add to my breed study blanket. I have all the wool is washed now, and now it needs to get processed, either carded or combed, or some combination of things, and then ready to spin. So the one that I carded this week was the Swedish Finull fine wool. It was the one that was completely white, had little tiny ringlets, and so I washed it, I carded it on my drum carder, and then I created roving from that. So I have, how many of these? I don't know, 5 or 6 of these kind of very loose little balls that I will be turning into yarn starting tomorrow. So this is what I'm going to start with, and then I'll be processing additional wools as we go forward. And somebody was asking in the comments about wanting to understand the difference between carding and combing and the techniques that were used. And I will tell you, I am no expert. I am learning. I still think of myself as sort of an advanced beginning spinner. So I cannot give tutorials on any of this, but I can show you what I do. And I will do that throughout the Tour de France. I will show you the equipment that I use to process things at different points, and just so that for non-spinners, they can kind of get a little introduction to the vocabulary that often comes up with spinning. So if you are participating in Tour de Fleece, let me know down in the comments. I'm interested to know and what other people are doing for Tour de Fleece and what their personal challenges might be. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.